I am Saleh Malaika. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Al Baraka Investment and Development Company in Saudi Arabia, one of the pioneering entities in the world in Islamic banking and finance, which has operation in about 30 countries of Islamic banking operation. I joined Al Baraka, the Al Baraka Group 10 years ago, and I did my PhD in finance and with the intention of being in Islamic banking eventually. I took interest in Islamic banking in the early 80s when the movement was at its conceptualization and its the heat of the early movement. So it caught my attention, being in the academic world and in business at the same time. It caught my attention. I became an investor in the Islamic banks, and then I decided to pursue a career in finance based on the modern financial theory, but having in mind the Islamic banking at the same time. And that became a reality, alhamdulillah, wa tawfiqillah, and I joined Al Baraka in 1991. Well, there is a wealth of literature and a wealth of activities under what's called Islamic economics in the at least in the first few hundred years after the Prophet peace be upon him. And for some reason, the Islamic world has retreated during the last 600 years, and therefore there wasn't much development after that. And now there is a comeback in today's world with the openness and globalization and so on. Islamic countries are endorsing these economic theories, the open world and the capital market development and so on, which happen to fit the Islamic financial theory, because Islamic banking is based on freedom of wealth and the openness, and it enhances competition and it enhances equitable trading measures. There are so many measures and guidelines in the Islamic jurisprudence which are pushing toward values which show a lot in the Western capital markets nowadays. I think the main reason is the colonization of the Islamic countries by the Western powers in the late 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And when that was over, after World War II, the colonial powers have left an infrastructure in those countries they have colonized. And among the infrastructure, aside from utilities and ports and airports and so on, which facilitated their their trade and their needs in those countries, they've also established banks there. So you'll find that the oldest bank in Saudi Arabia, for example, was the Hollandi Bank, the Dutch bank. In other countries as well, the first banks that were operated in the Islamic countries were mainly from the Western world. After the colonial era was over, there was an awakening among a lot of the leaders in the community that this form of banking is against the teaching of Islam, particularly when it comes to interest. But there are many other values, as I mentioned earlier, in promoting fairness and more equality and sharing risk and income and so on. So there were many voices, mainly in the 60s, and those voices grew more and more in the 70s, and finally they culminated in establishing the first few Islamic banks in 1975. Dubai Islamic Bank was one of the first, and the Islamic Development Bank also, which is an intra-government bank between the Islamic countries, and then in 1977 Jordan Islamic Bank, and so on. So the peak of that starting these few first Islamic banks were between the late 70s and the early 80s, and that's when it caught my attention and I joined the movement later on. Yes, I believe that in the United States, though the Muslim population is fragmented and dispersed over a large country and in many states, but because of the technological advancements, the internet and the telecommunication and so on, it's possible now to reach, a fragmented market. So now more than ever, it is possible to attract that niche market, which by many estimates is anywhere between 5 to 8 million Muslims in the United States. Indeed, this is a very large market. If we assume that they have an average GNP per capita at 35,000, by at least 5 million, that's 170 something billion dollars annually of potential, productivity. So there is tremendous wealth in that niche market, and I think it will be viable. It's just a matter of meeting the regulations in the United States. The United States has very rigorous regulations. It's one of the best in the world. It's meant to protect the investors and to enhance the financial system. And I think the Islamic banking can take advantage of that. It just needs an understanding of those requirements and meeting them. Yes, the awareness is always an obstacle. I mean, you can see that in the traditional equity markets and bond and stock markets, where the lack of understanding can sometimes affect the markets adversely. Of course, in this case, the understanding of Islamic finance and banking is if it's not well received, then of course it can pose its own problems. But what these conferences that are happening, like the one of today and others, they are enhancing that understanding in the society, and we are moving, we're converging, to more coherent understanding of those standards in Islamic bank and finance. And this has happened in any industry. It starts with diverse concepts and understandings, and then it converges as it grows. Well, it is growing, and I had a speech this morning, keynote speech this morning, which is quite lengthy, and the summary is that the globalization is helping Islamic banking to grow in the Islamic countries themselves. And the reason that this is true is because most of the Islamic countries do not have regulations for investment banking. They only have regulations for commercial banking. And they have less developed capital and financial markets. Most of these markets know only stocks in very small amounts. A typical market will have 100 companies, 200 companies, or 300 companies, except for Malaysia, which has a larger number. So as the globalization pushes its way, and the World Trade Organization takes a center stage in the world economy, the Islamic countries are going to adapt and open their markets and regulate, and by these regulations it's going to encourage Islamic banking and finance to grow in these countries. I have cited many countries that are advanced in endorsing Islamic banking, like Bahrain, Malaysia, Sudan, Pakistan, and so on, and some other countries which are considering seriously adapting its system to fit with the Sharia requirements, including Islamic banking and finance, like Kuwait, for example. Many of the Islamic banks that are onshore in the Gulf countries, for example, are growing at double-digit rate, and they enjoy a nice niche market there. In some other countries which are suffering from economic difficulties, like in Turkey, for example, there are 6 Islamic banks. Of course, they are going to suffer like the rest of the banks in the country. So the Islamic banks are subject to the economic environment they are in, if they are onshore. If they are offshore, the offshore is not really a very big market, so it is not expected to grow in a large way. That leaves the minority Muslims in the rest of the world, like in the United States and in many countries in Europe, and some parts of the Far East and in South Africa, for example. And in these markets, I believe the US has the highest potential and can set a very good example. If the Islamic banking movement proves feasible here, it is possible to extrapolate that experience into Europe and into other parts of the world. From that point of view, I mean, the world is moving toward more openness. Globalization is an economic phenomenon, but what you are talking about in terms of the dissemination of information across the world, this is due to the advancement in technology and telecom. And regardless of the globalization, it's happening because with the satellite telecommunication becoming so cheap and abundant, and also the fiber optic cables around the world and so on, and the emergence of the internet, the dissemination of information is available everywhere, whether it is negative information or positive information. It's up to the individual countries to regulate, to reduce the impact of that openness, but they cannot control it 100%. I mean, we have to admit that there is no way that you can control everything, because accessibility is there. If someone wants to access information, he can get it. Now, I always believe that one of the greatest things about the Islamic religion is that it works to regulate the Muslim from within more than from outside. I mean, it works from within. And of course, we're all human beings, and that cannot work perfectly with everyone. But at least in a major way, we know that praying 5 times a day and doing it in Jama'ah and the Jum'ah and the fasting and, you know, all the Sunnah and the Hadith and all these facts push the Muslim to, you know, to have a way of life which is going to keep him away from, you know, indulging into such things. But it's still the responsibility of the governments to not to make something like this available, you know, in public. But if it is accessible, there is no way that you can stop it. But you can at least stop it from becoming, you know, accessible publicly. There are 2 types of riba. There is riba nasi'a, which is based on the money for money, which is for the, you know, the time value of money. I give you a loan and I ask you to pay, I mean, a premium on it a month later or a year later, and there is no question that this is the riba which is haram. Then that is, you know, any form of interest. And then there is the other type of riba, riba al-fadl, which is, you know, which is not very well defined, but if you go to the literature, you will find that it is anything that leads to inequitable transaction, economic transaction between any two people. If there is an inequity in that transaction, then it is a kind of riba. And that is not very well defined because it could be in many different forms. I mean, it could be, the derivatives today, it could be. So it is very difficult to define it, but you have to look at the fundamentals of that economic relationship, analyze it and see if there are elements which are inducing unfairness, inequitability, and sharing the risk and profit, then it becomes a kind of riba.